Okay, operations security concepts. Going to cover operations responsibilities, operations personnel, configuration management, media access protection, system recovery, facsimile security, vulnerability and penetration testing, and of course attack types. Why would you need fax security? Why is it important to secure your fax line? Bless you.
It's not encrypted.
Yep, it's not encrypted, so if anybody's listening to the tones going back and forth, they can actually recreate everything that you're sending. And what's really interesting about faxes, especially going through a system, what it ends up doing is it converts the data that you're faxing into an image. For example, on a Windows box, maybe a TIFF, which is a multi-layer image file. It's an old image file. But otherwise, for anything that goes over the phone line, if it's listened to, basically intercept it and then recreate it. It's basically an encoding type issue as opposed to an encryption issue. So anybody that gets a good old tip and ring owns your system. Does everybody know what tip and ring is? Tip and ring is the good old telco term for basically the ground and the live wire for phone system. Usually you can have your different colors, for example, like orange and white or brown and white or whatnot, to where if somebody gets the live in the ground, they alligator tap it, then they have your line. So you still have the connection back and forth, but it's really easy to break into somebody's phone conversations or break into the line just by putting alligator clips on it. So what the alligator clips do is they break through the plastic and then make a connection with the wire and then to a little phone system that the individual has, which could be as advanced as an actual fax machine or other type of a utility, but usually it's just going to be a phone with alligator clamps. Okay, computer operations. Basically, we're going to go through system administration, basically routine activities required to keep systems and networks up and running. Within this, you're looking at fixing hardware and software issues. Again, that's going to be if CPU goes out, something overheats. I've seen a lot of instances to where, for example, if a habit goes out, then servers start to fail because they start to overheat, especially depending on the environment that you're in. You could be in an area to where it's too humid, so you have to deal with corrosion, or it's too dry, so you have to deal with static electricity and things like that, burning out a lot of the electronics. And of course, software issues, in case they ever break. Very rare that ever happens. There's also maintaining security mechanisms, media library, controlling maintenance and remote access, contingency planning. Everybody comfortable with contingency planning? Goes back to business continuity and disaster recovery. But basically, if something bad happens, you need a plan B. And basically how things usually happen in business, you need a plan C, D, E, and F, because you're usually living on plan B. Okay, incident handling. Also incident response. This could be not just the hacking incidents, but complete forensics within the organization as well. Licensing issues. This is a real fun one for a lot of organizations. How many people here have heard of 1-800-NO-PIRACY? Basically, it's an organization built up of several larger software organizations and a bunch of lawyers. And their mandate is that every call that comes in gets investigated. And this basically allows people to either do an anonymous call or a targeted call if they find out an organization has unlicensed software. For example, good old Microsoft Office. There's a lot of organizations out there that they buy one copy and then they reproduce that copy, say, 1,000 times. And this is the type of scenario that a lot of people call in for and saying that I know this organization's not going through legitimate licensing processes. They should be looked into. The big issue I've seen, or a big problem, are system administrators that would go through. They would install all these pirated softwares or unlicensed copies on the system. They get disgruntled and then call the number saying the company that I used to work with, I was either fired or I don't like them anymore. They have all these unlicensed copies. So it's a huge problem from a management perspective because from their eyes, they don't see a difference. They think everything's been installed legitimately and that they may have all the licensing. But there's a good possibility they don't. There's also the issue for people bringing in pirated software. For example, they download it off Kazaa, or if they even have Emule or whatever dozen other programs they have out there, Morpheus or whatnot. They download pirated software, or Juarez, as it used to be called, install it on the system, and now the organization could possibly be liable for the intellectual property theft. Another issue with that is a lot of these pieces of software, they do have Trojans in the back end as well. So not only keeping licensing issues, but preventing things from like P2P applications from running on the system is definitely an important step in protecting the organization. Also, of course, applying patches and hot fixes. There's backup and recovery.
I have a question.
Yeah.
With a lot of this software, do they not have the ability, are they not writing in more and more the ability to call home, and then the home computer can determine if there are multiple licenses, multiple keys running on one machine?
A lot of organizations are, however, most don't still. Because that takes a lot of design and basically planning ahead of time for the software.
Right.
So if the vendor itself does not have the budget at the time, or if they're a relatively new organization, then they still don't do that. I know a lot of pieces of software that don't. I know a lot of pieces of software too that don't have the capability of calling home because they're installed in environments that block all traffic going out.
Yeah.
So most software still needs the way to register or validate it without an internet connection. So, I guess like for example, like a government type side, it would be anybody on a network that does not have internet connection, like a research network or an FOUO network that's protected from the internet for some reason, or anyone that would have a higher classification as well. Okay, there's also maintaining input-output controls, variance detection, and pen testing. So technically, this is all part of the operations aspect of the organization, but when it comes down to it, again, pen testing is going to be one of those things where it's more of a detective control because you're looking for specific items. So eventually you can prevent them, but you're trying to detect things before the bad guys do. And of course, applying patches and hot fixes is a huge issue. A lot of people have to go through the change control process to do that as well. I've seen many organizations have it where they will only do it off hours, for example, like 10 o'clock at night starting on an off day, such as Tuesday or Thursday, because they have a lot of meetings on Monday or whatnot. If anything happens on Tuesday nights, they could have an all-nighter and usually be recovered by Wednesday. But when it comes down to it, the majority of change control as well makes it to where there's some sort of a plan B. So if applying the patch makes the system crash or does anything bad to the system, they have to be able to remove that and then backdate it at basically a moment's notice as well. It's one of the huge problems about patching is that either A, the patch is broken, or the environment that the system's on is different than what the patch was initially designed for. I've seen several scenarios to where you have high-end servers, good old multiprocessor, lots of gig, whatnot, install an operating system, and as soon as you install patches on it, now it does the boot loop. So it tries to go into the Windows OS and then just dies. All of the other Windows servers perfectly fine, but there's just something different with that one group of servers, which could be hardware related. It could be a combination of the software related as well. So there's all kinds of variables that you have to take into consideration. Okay, some of the threats to computer operations. Of course, there's user error and omissions. It's probably one of the biggest ones. Good old fat fingering. Then there's the un-PC term of TSTO. How many people heard of that one before? The TSTO error you'll hear sometimes in tech support circles, which is too stupid to operate. So a lot of people will go that instead of it being like a memory error or anything like that, if you ever do see that in a tech support call, that's what they're referring to.
It's like an ID10T error.
Yep, ID10T. And that one, if you don't know what ID10T is, if you write it down on a piece of paper, it's basically leet speak. So, but that basically just refers to people that are doing things, for example, like fat fingering, putting in the wrong account number, goes to a specific area. These are not malicious acts. These are things that if the individual was either paying more attention or if they had better understanding of the environment that they were in, they may not have done that. Okay, internal fraud. These are a little bit harder to take into consideration as far as if you have somebody who has an inherent trust. So again, with the clearance levels type scenario. In the government, they have the clearance levels to where they trust you to specific content. They trust you to access specific data because they trust you at a certain level because they did the specific background. Just because you do the background checks or just because you have the specific trust doesn't mean the individual is not going to do anything bad. Same thing within the commercial aspect is that if you hire somebody for a bookkeeper, you're giving them a huge amount of trust. It's basically the same as giving them, for example, secret clearance or whatnot to get special data, because anything they touch can harm the organization. And I've seen several scenarios and worked on a couple investigations to where individuals in a bookkeeping environment would also have payroll. They would have everything that had to deal with money within the organization because it was a smaller organization. And what they'd end up doing was embezzling money by seeing what credit card the company had. They would get the same credit card from your favorite credit card company. And then what they do is they would pay the first check to their credit card company and then pay the second check to the company's credit card company and then try to delete the record going to their credit card company. Not thinking that there's going to be an audit trail through this whole thing because they figured that, well, since I deleted the record, the software's not going to have any evidence that anything happened. Well, the software that they're dealing with in this specific case had basically 5 databases that it hit. The main database that the person sees from the program, then it had a transactional database that showed every entry, every deletion, and then it had a backup of that. And then it also had another database and a backup of that database that went through and did manual checks for all the other database records to make sure that the audit database was correct and that all the transactions were put into that one as well. But in this specific case, the person was embezzling for a good 1.5 years before the owner found out. And they were wondering why they weren't making money. And when they did the books, went back the 1.5 years, the individual stole over, was it $350,000. So internal fraud's a huge problem. Loss of system and network capability. This could be from user error, internal fraud. It could be from hardware failure as well. Also, malicious hackers, criminal hackers. These are going to be people from the outside usually. This is not going to be your disgruntled employee. There's also collusion, which then goes back to internal fraud or potentially economic espionage. Collusion is where 2 or more people coming together to carry out a fraudulent activity. How many people here have watched Office Space before? Classic. If you haven't, it's definitely something you probably should. I know it's a little dated by now, but anybody in the IT industries probably has some sort of connection to it. But basically, 3 of the characters got together, they were friends, and 2 of the characters were getting fired, and they're hardworking programmers. And the one guy that basically just gave up because he was hypnotized to be a little bit more lax, he was getting a raise, became management basically. So they got together, 2 of them basically wrote a virus, and then he put the virus inside of the organization's computer system. And what it was supposed to do was grab data, basically a salami attack, and then round off a fraction of a penny, and put that little fraction of a penny into a secondary account. And then after 10 years, there'd be hundreds of thousands of dollars in this one account. Well, the one programmer, unfortunately, and that's what made the part of the movie funny, was moved the decimal over the wrong direction or whatnot, and instead of fractions of a penny, it was a lot of money. So within one day, they had like $170,000. So they went through and then tried to fix that. But that was a whole portion of collusion, is because there's more than one person working together to commit fraud against an organization. And the specific attack they used was a salami attack because they were slicing off little pieces of the transaction as it went through the wire. That is one thing that you will need to know for the test or the different attack types. We'll cover that as well. It's also espionage, both corporate espionage and government espionage. Basically, you have an entity working within an organization and they don't have full loyalties to that organization. They're working for another organization or secondary. which could be they're full-time working for that secondary, so it'd be a double, or it could be to where they're just taking information like trade secret information and then selling it to an outside entity. This is a huge issue, and it's a lot bigger than a lot of people realize. There's actually an organization called the Business Espionage Controls and Countermeasures Association, or BECA, and its primary goal in life is to cover economic espionage type scenarios. Basically, is started by a few ex-Navy intel guys that got together and wanted to use their experience and on one side push into the corporate world. And they have not only a lot of physical but a lot of technological interests as well. There's software and hardware malfunctions. Again, rare that ever happens, but it does happen. There's also physical facility and system attacks. Physical facility, again, this is more of a mom and pop shop, less than 100 employees or whatnot. Had it to where this guy had some garage doors open. And what ended up happening, people knew that he had a computer system in his office. So what they did was they drove a truck through his fence and then through his garage door, and it opened up the garage just enough for a bunch of people to sneak in and then start stealing all of his servers, all of his workstations. And they didn't steal the equipment because of the data that was on it. They just stole the equipment because they wanted to sell the information. So he was able to recover at least his server because somebody that was able to purchase it out of a pawn shop saw that it had some interesting information in it. But stuff like that actually happens all the time, to where the physical facility is attacked or broken into, and things are stolen from the basic financial aspect as opposed to the more severe, I want to get the data aspect. And basically what he ended up having to do was put bars in front of the garage door, basically the ones that rose up, and then towards the day when he's putting in a bunch of trucks or whatnot, they go down in the ground, so you can still drive through them. Then that's also why you'll see a lot of organizations or companies that have those big cement, basically girders in front of their doors or in front of their windows, not only to keep people from breaking in, but again, the good old accidental issues, to where if somebody's brakes don't work too well, they go right through the window. Okay, backup maintenance. Key part of maintaining the availability and integrity of data is a reliable backup, and this is the best form of insurance, because if your data goes out, if your data dies, then it's going to minimize the damages that you're going to have. For example, if your server goes out. I know a lot of people will, especially nowadays, individuals, small companies will buy these big hard drives, these terabyte drives, which if they say RAID 0, are actually 2 500 gigs usually, just mirrored together. One drive goes out, all their data is gone. So if they don't have a backup, pretty much everything that they were storing on that quote-unquote external or backup drive is now completely gone. So if they had 2 drives and they were doing a backup, or if they had a RAID 5 system or whatnot, then they could potentially recover the data really quick. So basically what it comes down to is the maintenance. I've seen a lot of people with tapes. Tapes are relatively popular. They'd go through and they'd be religious about putting in a new tape, let the backup process go through, taking it out, putting in a new one, taking the one that was supposedly written to off-site. And then when something bad happens, they bring the tapes back on site, they try to recover the data, but it's either empty or the stuff on there is completely damaged because the whole process was broken. And they didn't look at the log files to make sure that the backup actually happened. So that's a problem I've seen quite often, is either the tapes were bad or the backup software was just not writing to the tape. Okay, backups are also essentially part of maintaining operations security. Again, because if your content is stolen, you have the data back. Okay, changing workstation location. For the CISSP, this is a very important concept. In real-world scenarios, I've seen potential problems with this because people get attached to specific areas. For example, especially if you have office environment. It's a lot easier if you have a cubicle space. But basically, changing workstation location, that can be used for means to improve or maintain security because it minimizes the probability somebody's going to install unauthorized content or have potentially sensitive information on it. Because if their workstation goes from their desk to somebody else, or if they have to change desks completely, then that other next individual's good possibility they may find something that's going to be on that system. Also, changing a workstation prevents user from altering the system, and non-permanent workstations encourage users to keep all materials stored on the network servers where it can easily be protected. How many people here have heard of hot swapping or hot bunking, especially when it comes to cubicles? Basically, it'd be to where you bounce either from one cube to another or you share cubes with other individuals. So I've seen that happen a lot in 24-hour shops.
That statement says changing users' workstation prevents a user from entering the system? Does it
Ye-
really prevent them, or does it discourage?
It minimizes and discourages them. So people will still probably do it as soon as they get a new system. They're going to change the background. They're going to change a couple other things. But if, for example, if they only have the system for a month, chances are they're not going to be installing Winamp on it as easy, or other types of media players or bad stuff. So, but the only issue you have is it socially acceptable or psychologically acceptable in your organization? Because I know a lot of organizations, the culture does not allow you to do stuff like that. So in real life, that's basically what you have to weigh. Okay, need to know in principle of least privilege. Basically, these are two standards of high security environments. Requirement is to have access to, knowledge about, or possession of the data. Users should be granted the least amount of access to the secure environment as possible. And again, the reason is because you want them to have everything they need to do their job, but nothing more than that. Because there's always possibilities they may come across specific things that they shouldn't have access to. One fun thing that I've always found amazing was good old printers. If you're in an environment that has sensitive data, could be a bookkeeping environment to where you have sensitive financial information, or even a classified environment, if you have a printer which is in a community area, if you print things, a lot of people get sidetracked by phone, sidetracked by something else, Minesweep, Tetris, or whatnot. So when they print something, they leave it on the printer for 5 minutes, 5 hours. And whenever anybody goes to the printer, if they print anything, of course they're going to look for their paper. If they see anything of interest, they are now exposed to the information that you left there, or the person that printed it off left there. That's something that a lot of people do not realize as being a huge security risk or a potential violation, because they see it as being, well, I printed it, I'm going to eventually get it. And that could cause, especially in a commercial environment, if you have financial records. Let's say if you were doing your time card or payroll type scenarios, people look at it and see that, hey, so-and-so is making more than I am, now I'm not going to work as hard type scenario. So you can do a lot of discontent there.
So how do you prevent the CIO from getting full administrative privileges on his laptop?
Just, I don't know, I'm going to answer from where I'm at, but we don't give it to them. I mean,
Yeah, either A, don't, period, or they have signed a waiver. So if anything bad happens to it, he's taking full responsibility, legal liability, which means that full jail time goes to that person or full fines go to that person. But usually either you don't and you don't give them the option, or if they're VIPs and they're louder than everybody else and they make everybody else's life more painful, you find the DAA or the owner of the system, and they have to sign a contract or a waiver saying that this specific person, he's taken or she's taken responsibility for any wrongdoings that person's going to do. You may not word it in that aspect, but the waiver process, that's what it is.
if I may inject one more thing, where I work, even the director, if he wants evident privileges for whatever reason, he follows the process, the internal process of the paperwork, even though
Yeah.
that ultimately he will endorse it himself, but even goes to the deputy director. So, you know, it sets an example in a way, which is very important.
So that's a great thing to do. If a person wants more, they have to go through the same process everybody else would. And that right there shows the due care and due diligence. If the organization were ever getting any sort of liability issue, that's going to minimize everything, because everybody, even the top down, is held to the same standards. It's when you get into the issues to where this happens a lot, unfortunately, where your C-level execs, your upper management, your VIPs, which could be specific individuals because they're friends with the C-level, if they get special privileges and they don't have to go through the same paperwork everybody else does, If that can be proven, then there could be things, for example, like harassment openings, there could be discrimination openings, there could be all kinds of different openings in the liability aspect, especially if the system is compromised by any one of the people that didn't have to go through the normal chain of command. So it's definitely a huge concern that a lot of people don't see as being that big of an issue until it actually happens. Okay, privileged operation functions. Here's some great ones. Good old using operating system control commands. I know with Vista, they ended up making it to where it's more like the Unix Mac community, to where if you want to run anything potentially dangerous, you now have to run it as usually an administrator. What's funny about that scenario is because their market share is on the opposite side of what the Unix, the Linux, the Mac market share is. On this side, or the Starnix community, they're used to, if you want to run anything as root, you have to do the SU, or you actually have to put in username and password to do it. On the Windows side, people are not used to having to do that. So you have a huge fight back from a lot of the smaller companies, organizations, mom and pop shops, people that are not computer savvy, because now they're not able to run specific applications without this pop-up box, which is annoying, comes up and says run as, and then they hit OK. So it's still not as hard to do dangerous functions as you will see in your Starnix environments, but it's still, they're trying to make it an extra step. Pre-Vista, a lot of things would just automatically run. So it may not warn you, it may just run in the background. You were able to do your good old ipconfig, some of your network commands, and then within Vista, you can't do a lot of the network commands like ipconfigs / release. It basically makes it to where if you're on a DHCP network, it releases your IP address, and then if you do ipconfig / renew, it then goes to the DHCP server and then tries to get a new IP address. They see that as more advanced task, so they try to get the basic user away from doing that. Also, configuration interfaces. There's no reason a non-administrator or non-owner of the system should be able to go through an administration interface and then alter anything. I know a lot of websites will have the good old /admin capability. So if you go to the website, imatarget.com /admin, and then a lot of times it'll go to the default index.php and then allow you for the administrator username and password to be able to play around with the website. If people leave that by default, those are usually easy to find, especially if it's an open source product or if it's a commercial product. They're usually going to have specific folders that they're going to be in. So either A, change it, or B, make access controls to where if you do not have a specific IP range or are logged in through like a single sign-on process, you can't even see that folder.
What do you see in organizations? I know for ours, we have hundreds of employees running around with laptops doing assisted launches. And what happens is they're in a controlled environment while they're here. They go to a launch site, they have their laptop, and they got to print something out at a launch site, and we get zillions of phone calls to people who can't change the printers and stuff like that. Do you see that a lot in terms of, you know?
Yes. One scenario would be basically having it to where they can VPN into a network and then have the map printer if it's on the same network.
Right.
That type of scenario to where the location that they go to needs to set up the environment for the telecommuters before they get there. Either that or have mobile printers, so you don't even have to deal with connecting.
Maybe that's a better way. Well, these guys are out in the woods, you know, Pacific, you know, wherever, and it's just we got to print stuff out.
I have seen mobile users be a huge problem, especially going from their main location to, let's say, a remote location or a finger or some other organization. And when it comes down to it, there's nothing much the person can do.
Right.
As far as the user is concerned, it has to be the entity that they're going to. So whenever they connect into it, it may have it to where as soon as they connect in, they may be running like a Hercules system on there. So if they don't have the up-to-date patches, the up-to-date antivirus, it could even go as far as quarantining them until they're up to the security policy, and then allowing them into a secured subnet to where they have access to a printer.
Yeah, I have that scenario, because I do telework, plus I work in a satellite office in Herman. And when I have to go to, when I'm in the satellite office in Herman, I'm not directly connected to the DISA network, where I have the VPN, and they have a printer set up for me. So when I go into the office, I have to inform VPN, I have to disconnect from the VPN in order to print. But if I get on DISA.net at one of the sites, I have printers set up automatically once I log in.
Yeah. Yeah, those profiles are nice things.
Yeah.
So, because yeah, if it's in the same organization, profiles work great. But I know a lot of scenarios that were either not same organization, or if they are, certain subnets are not shared throughout the organization. So there's also accessing audit logs. Why would that be a problem for non-administrators or non-trusted individuals? Yep. If they have read-write capability, deleting tracks, altering things, even if they just have read capability, some audit logs, for example, web server logs. If somebody goes to an insecure website and types in username and password, and the website does a get as opposed to a post, then the username and password are going to be in the web server log, because it's part of the URL now. So simple things like that. Audit logs are definitely something that should be secured. Managing user accounts, again, that's a problem, because a lot of people have it to where if they give the capability to add accounts to anybody, then of course they're probably going to add accounts, or at least there's going to be one person out of 100 that says, well, I want to add a special account, so whenever I download things that are inappropriate, it's no longer tied to my main account or do anything in that aspect. I've seen a lot of, unfortunately, admins do the same thing, to where they set up their own play accounts. So when it comes down to it, they have their main account, then they have their quote-unquote admin account, and then they also have 3 or 4 other admin accounts that are not documented or listed. And that also comes down to, you should actually audit all your user accounts and validate who they belong to and that they're absolutely needed. And then it goes back down to least privilege and the need to know principle. Okay, configuring security mechanism controls. Running scripts, tasks, and automated tools. Scripts is a big issue, because if you have programming capability, there's all kinds of fun things you can do with the system. It's also backup and restore system. Controlling communications, using a database recovery tools and log files, and of course, controlling system reboots. There are cases to where a user may have to reboot a system, especially depending on the environment that they're running in, but usually that is not something that they need. The main reason is, for example, if you have a guest or if you have somebody that has physical access in your organization that shouldn't be there, like doing a pen test or actually somebody trying to hack your system, they have a live Linux CD. If you turn off the capability for them to turn off the workstations, then they're not going to be able to reboot it, unless they basically just unplug it from the back. But if it's protected, like in a cage environment or whatnot, to where they can't get to the cords, or they can't get to the power button, or it's physically locked off or locked on, then that's going to be a bigger challenge for the majority of people. Okay, standards of due care and due diligence. Due care is basically reasonable care to protect the interests of the organization. And due diligence is practicing the activities and that maintain the due care efforts. Again, you're looking at policies and procedures. This is the main thing I keep pushing, because it's one of the easiest ways to get it through to people, is that policies and procedures, just having them written is going to be your due care, or having them written well. Your due diligence is to go through and basically evolve them. If you see any holes in your policies and procedures, write amendments to them. Also, do pen testing, do vulnerability assessments, and what that's going to do is basically check your security gap versus what's already in your policies and procedures and your baselines. So the act of having the things there, your due care, the act of doing things are going to be your due diligence. Okay, privacy and protection. Protection from personal information and disclosure to any unauthorized individual or entity. This gets even worse depending on what industry segment you're in. If you're just your basic medium-sized company or mom and pop shop that doesn't deal with government, financial, health, or publicly traded organizations, then it's going to be a lot less, not really important, but a lot less pushed as far as liability issues. But if you deal with, for example, like Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, GBLA, FSMA, NERC, FERPA, all the other ones, privacy starts to become a huge concern. The line between public information and private information is often blurred. For example, with PII, there's been several organizations that have pushed out definitions for PII, or personal identifiable information. These definitions are usually gray enough to be going either way on specific information. For example, if I were to send an email to somebody internally, which had a signature, which had the location that I was in, or the building I was in, or physical location, my internal email address, internal phone number, and somebody were to forward that email to somebody else. Some people's definitions of PII, or organizations' definitions of PII, states that that is going to be against the regulations or against the rules because it's going to have my physical location, my internal phone number, internal email address. And because I didn't specifically give the one person permission to forward that to somebody outside the organization, it's now a violation. Other people will consider that the phone numbers, the emails, that's not PII, but social security information and health information is. So definitely, depending on where you work, the interpretation of PII, it could be a very interesting concern. That's another thing as far as email is concerned, just as an FYI for everybody. If you ever get an email, how many people here have heard of poor man copyright? The poor man's copyright is basically proof that a person wrote something or created something at a specific time. It used to be if somebody made a piece of artwork or design, what they could do is they could mail it to themselves to the U.S. Postal Service, and then it would have basically the timestamp on the outside of the envelope. So if anybody else came out with the same idea or the same work and said it was there, you can bring the item to court and say, okay, open the package, it's the same piece of information. Well, email is the same type of scenario, is that if you write an email to somebody and then somebody were to forward that on, in technicality, that's kind of like a poor man's copyright, and if you don't give the individual the permission to forward that email, there's a possibility there could be some sort of retribution on it. So if you are going to forward people's email, definitely get the permission beforehand, because it could either be PII or it could be other sorts of privacy issues. Okay, security control types. Directive controls is a security tool used to guide the security implementation of an organization. Preventative controls is a security mechanism tool or practice that can deter or mitigate desired actions. Detective control is a security mechanism used to verify whether the directive or preventative controls have been successful. And also corrective controls are instructions, procedures, or guidelines used to reverse the effects of an unwanted activity. What would be a good example of a corrective control? Probably a technical corrective control. Which would be instructions, procedures, or guidelines used to reverse the effects of an unwanted activity. Backups, primary thing like disaster recovery, data recovery. If anything bad happens, you go through the process of bringing the data back, preferably from an off-site location. I have, however, had scenarios to where organizations trying to get like an ATO or whatnot out of a like a CNA process, they have to have off-site backups. So they get around it by saying, okay, the off-site backup is now the building right across the street. So that means that, yeah, if one catches fire, the other's probably going to be damaged too or whatnot, especially if a tornado comes through, they're both gone. Okay, operations controls. Looking at communications, hardware and software, boundary devices, which are of course going to be your firewalls, and then also boundary in the physical side, which is going to be your fencing. Processing equipment, password files, application program libraries, application source code, operating system utilities, proprietary packages, main storage, movable storage, and sensitive critical data. A lot of times people have for example, like application and program libraries, they may not get vetted after a while or whatnot, to where that's a huge problem because a lot of applications will use these universally, or they share these libraries within the applications. And same thing with application source code. If you do not vet them, for example, have even do MD5 hashes on the code once they go through change control, and then before they get put into another code, MD5 them again to see if anything changed or was altered. If the MD5 doesn't match, you know that you have to go to a previous version. Okay, vulnerability and pen testing. Two different things. Just so everybody knows, the vulnerability assessments or vulnerability testing is going to be you're using automated tools usually to find potential vulnerabilities. Pen testing or ethical hacking is going to be when you're actually validating those findings or trying to find things from scratch. But basically what you're going through is not the automated test or whatnot. You could use automated tools for pen testing, such as Core Impact or some of the others, but or Canvas, what they end up doing is they exploit the system and then they call back home. So there are no false positives. With vulnerability assessment, there's usually a lot of false positives, things that you should be able to verify that the patches were up to date or so forth. What's interesting about the pen testing utilities, even though some of them are automated, they do exploit callback home and they give you a list of the vulnerability it exploited, which still there could be a lot of false negatives, but the one that it called home on is definitely an accurate assessment. Okay, before carrying out a vulnerability test, things you need to be agreed upon are the goals of the assessment. There's also evaluates the true security posture of an environment, identifies as many vulnerabilities as possible, and tests how the systems react to certain circumstances of attacks. Depending on the vulnerability assessment tool, same thing with pen testing. But vulnerability assessment tools, you'll see a big list of things that are potentially dangerous. So whenever you're scanning, it has a list of items that could potentially cause a denial of service on the system. If you uncheck those and only do quote-unquote the safe scan, there's still the possibility, because you touched the system, you could DOS the system. So that's one thing that there's still an issue with. If you're doing an actual test like once a week, there could be ramifications of that. If you're doing a pen testing utility, there's chances are a lot higher because it is exploiting the system, and if the exploit breaks, you just crash the server. So there's basically a level of effort and level of risk involved with each one. You also need a written agreement from management. This protects the tester. The written agreement is going to be your get out of jail free card, depending on the scope of the contract. Here's one thing that a lot of pen testers do not look for, or anybody doing on the ethical hacking or whatnot, is if, or at least on their first couple, because they get hit with this, somebody says, I have a domain, I'm a target.com, I want you to test my domain, or I want you to test my company. If you test that company, find out the IP address, and then start scanning that IP address and start attacking that IP address, there's a good possibility they may be a hosted system. So that one domain is now basically on the same server as, let's say, 500 other domains. So even though you have the get out of jail free card for that one company or that one system, you don't have the get out of jail free card for the 500 other companies, which would be the 499 websites and then the hosting company itself. So that's an issue as far as scope of the test. Definitely needs to be ironed out, and information gathering phase probably should be communicated with the target or the client before the actual test continues. Saying, okay, this is the web server that we found, these are all of the additional subdomains, this is the IP address we have for it. Do you own the IP address? Is it okay to test it? And if they say yes, then they're taking responsibility type scenario. But when it comes down to it, is you need the written agreement from the management. Also ensures that there are no misunderstandings. I've had several scenarios to where they give you a company name, and then you do the good old ARIN lookup. You look at all the IP addresses that are associated with that company name. And then you go back to the organization and you say, okay, which one of these do I need to attack, or which do I attack all of them? And I've had recently a company come back and say, none of those are our IP addresses. These are our IP addresses. Well, the person was misinformed, so started doing the scan and found out that other organizations had IP addresses on their web servers. Then I instantly come back and say, okay, could you please verify? And then he verified that all the items in ARIN were correct. So all those IP addresses actually were theirs. So then basically had to start the test all over. So that's usually whenever I do a scan, you do your basic port scan, and then if you see anything on port 80, you just go to the website on that port 80 through either a web browser or through your Netcat banner grab. The attack steps. There's first one's recon. This is basically intelligence gathering, or could be open source intelligence, whatnot, or competitive intelligence. How many people have heard of competitive intelligence before? There's an organization out there called CISSP, which is Society of Competitive Intelligence Professionals. Basically, it's a whole group that deals with this type of scenario. It's where you try to find enough information on a target which could influence another target, for example. I know some people specialize in competitive intelligence. They work for company A, and then they try to get a lot of information on company B to see what flagship products they're doing, if they're hiring or if they're firing, seeing how the organization is actually running. And that's going to give a competitive edge to company A. From pen testing standpoint, it's definitely a good utility to do, because the more you know about the target before you touch the target, the less likely you're going to be able to get caught within IDS and so forth. How many people here have heard of the Maltego product or project? Maltego's basically a website. This guy made Evolution, and Evolution was a program that was released a couple years ago. He went to DEF CON, basically talked about it, and then a lot of the sites got mad at him because he was basically using spidering engines to go through their sites to get information on specific keywords. So places like Facebook, those type of organizations, which were social sites, yes, but the social sites were getting mad about terms of service, potential failures. So he changed Evolution and made a program called Perturba. Perturba made Maltego. And then basically Maltego is an open source intelligence gathering utility. So you put in a name, and then it goes to a bunch of different websites, then tries to find email addresses, phone numbers, basically websites that are associated with that name, or vice versa. You put in an IP address, and then it tries to find domains, emails associated with the DNS or whatnot, any sort of public knowledge records connected to the keywords that you put in there. And depending on the content that you're looking for and how easily available some of the information is, it's definitely a good utility. For example, a lot of the organizations that are on Zone H, I did a basic Evolution or Maltego search on them and was able to find the owner of the website, basically the heads of the organizations, and then from there basically spider out and then find out all the emails from the organization. From there, sometimes even find the real names of the people with the email and then their phone numbers outside of what was registered in the DNS for the main domain. So with the recon, definitely important. Maltego. And it's from Perturba.com. And then what I can do is actually on that links file, I'll go ahead and pop up during lunch, because there's a couple others as well, like that centralops.net. You don't get as much open source information, but it's another reconnaissance tool that I use because it uses somebody else's IP address to do the DNS who is, the network who is, trace route, and then a banner grab on a few sites and whatnot. So you're not attributed to the actual scan. How many people here have heard of Edgar before?
What?
Edgar, it's a database. Basically, it's for the Security Exchange Commission or SEC. They have it to where any publicly owned company or whatnot goes through and then has to put specific information that you can go into this database and look at. So you can find individuals, for example, like board members or C-level execs, phone numbers, other type of sensitive information for an organization or a target. And especially if you're doing a social engineering attack, that's a very good resource as well. Again, there's a lot of marketing content like the when I was mentioning yesterday, but basically it comes down to a lot of information that you can find in regular resources you can use to do the attack. There's been several people I've talked to that have not been on the pen tester side, but what they would specifically state is that if they have a couple interesting targets, they will actually research them or put them in a queue to be researched and start playing around with them for about 6 months before they actually attack them. And then they'll do the whole recon, the whole open source intel gathering, things like that, and then say, go to Monster, Dice, Career Builder, look for any HR requests for open jobs so you can see what technologies are being run in the background, and then look for anybody's resumes that have worked with that company, see what experience they have. Because a lot of times people in resumes, especially resumes, and put sensitive information in it, such as project names, technology used within the organization, because some people do not go through their internal HR to vet the resumes before they put them back up on the internet. Because I know a lot of companies have that as a prereq. If you're going to put your resume on the internet, it has to be vetted to make sure no sensitive trade secret or classified information gets put in there. But regardless, it's probably going to be out there. Okay, and then you do scanning. This is going to be identifying systems that are running and the services on each active system. So this is going to be once you've identified all your potential targets through the recon. You're going to say, okay, if you go to Aaron, you find the IP block that they're on. Now you're going to do like an ICMP scan, see which ones are going to ping back. Okay, say you have 5 active, and then you may do turn ping off on a scan, and then see which systems are going to communicate back on any port. So you do a full port scan. And then you can see which ones are blocking ICMP, which ones aren't, which may tell you that a specific subnet basically is allowing ICMP through, other subnets are not. Which will also tell you if port 80 is running. Port 80 is a common HTTP server. On systems, or especially on targets, the majority of the vulnerabilities that you're going to find are probably going to be through a web interface, such as your basic 443 or port 80. A lot of times you also see 8080 and 8000. Those are also common secondary web servers. The reason I say that is the majority of vulnerabilities are associated with bad coding practices, and a website has a lot of code on there that a lot of times are not vetted. So if somebody puts up a website or an internal website, you may see things like cross-site scripting or SQL injection. And then if you see the cross-site scripting, then you can target that as well for the internal organization. Email servers are fun as well, because email servers, a lot of times you can enumerate all the users within an organization just by either using the verify within the SMTP server or using the RCPT2 command within an SMTP server. And then if the user is valid, it will come back as saying that sender okay. If it's invalid, then you get some sort of error. So a lot of times if you don't know the username, the popular thing a lot of organizations do is the first name dot last name, or the first name last initial at domain, or last name first initial at domain. So you can also brute force those if you can't do any guessing. Next thing you want to do is gain access. This is exploiting identified vulnerabilities to gain access to unauthorized systems. In reality, the majority of networks today are relatively secure compared to what they were 5-10 years ago. So a pen tester could go through and find a dozen vulnerabilities relatively easy, let's say 10 years ago. Now, a lot of the vulnerabilities are relatively tied up. So you're not just looking for exploiting system vulnerabilities, but the human factor. Because the majority of the time in pen tests, it's gone from the technical side to where you find a web server with directory transversal. Now you just backdoored it with Netcat because it had TFTP on the system. To now you have to talk somebody into switching a username and password at an admin level, pretending to be somebody on the road that you can't get into a VPN. Once they change username and password, you can log into their internal VPN. Now you have access at whatever account level that individual had. So a lot of the gaining access is no longer exploiting the software as much as it used to be. A lot of it's now moving to the social engineering aspect. There's maintaining access. This is basically going through and uploading malicious software or some sort of backdoor. Between the gaining access and maintaining access, there's another step, but basically depends on where you are. A lot of people hit the maintaining access part first. So if their exploit loses connection, they don't have a problem. But the next one is going to be privilege escalation, which if you can do a privilege escalation as soon as you do the gain access, then your maintaining access is going to be at the higher level. But some people, what they'll do is they'll do the maintaining access, like for example, put up a Netcat session or some sort of Trojan, and then put a sniffer on there. And then over time, they eventually get a username and password for a higher account, and then they basically reinstall the Trojan at that higher level account or another piece of software. Then, of course, there's covering tracks. This is carrying out activities to hide malicious activities. Basically, this is anti-forensics. There's many ways of doing this. You can delete log files. You can try to wipe slack space on the hard drive. If you're having specific files on there that you're dealing with, you can even write your software. For example, if your software has JPEG files that are logos, and they're cool logos that everybody would be able to recognize if they saw them, you might even be able to change the header information. So whenever you're running your application, it looks for that changed header and then replaces it with the original header. So it works for you, but it doesn't open up for anybody else type scenario. So there's a lot of little things you can do to cover tracks. And the whole issue with anti-forensics is you're not making things impossible, but you're making things harder for the investigator to actually find anything. And for example, if you change a header and a file type, the majority of forensic software will not know what the file is going to be if you change the header, because what they look for is the extension. If the extension's been changed, then they check the header. So they do file signature analysis, which again, back for JPEG is going to be YOYA or JFIF, or the common header extensions for a JPEG. And it could be considered a DAT or for a file extension or whatnot. So when you double click on it, the operating system is going to open it up with your default DAT viewer, which may or may not be an image viewer. But if you look at it through any sort of forensics utility, or you open up that DAT file into a JPEG viewer, it's instantly going to say that I don't care what the backend extension is, I see what the header is, this is how I'm going to decode it. Okay, good old honeypots. These are usually placed in a DMZ. A lot of times they are placed internally. For the main reason is to catch unauthorized scans and then also potential malware. But usually a lot of times they're placed in the DMZ to minimize the possibility that, or the probability that your system is going to get hacked, basically. So you're making one that's really vulnerable out there, or it may only have one or two vulnerabilities, but one that's enticing enough to get the attacker to use that as opposed to attacking the real servers that are out there. It's basically sacrificial lamb on the network. The goal is that the hacker will attack this system instead of the production systems. And it is enticing because many ports are going to be open and services running. So if a real good honeypot would be, for example, a system that is running, or a honeypot virtual environment that looks like it's running IIS-5 with a dual Unicode vulnerability. And that may be the only vulnerability on the system. And that's a very common one to do, or potentially the RPC DCOM vulnerability. Again, if everything else is tied down, there's only two vulnerabilities. So a person scanning it may think they hit the jackpot when they found those two vulnerabilities and then try to get into the system. If you have one that has too many ports open and too many vulnerabilities, that's usually a telltale sign that something's wrong, and the attacker will see that and then go to the next lowest hanging fruit, which is hopefully a real server.